America's Mr. Right, Jason Lewis.
I want to get one thing straight right off the bat. I want to make certain I'm in the right place. Is this the Acorn Rally? Hi, I'm Representative Joe Wilson. Actually, the real reason I'm in Denver today is because President Obama came to Minneapolis and I had to get out of town. Jason, thanks for that warm introduction, my friend. You read it just the way I wrote it. Of all the introductions I've ever had, I gotta say that one right there was the most recent. Now, it is true, I did run for Congress out here. It's no secret I ran for Congress, although it seemed like one at a time. I would go and give these speeches and people would come up to me and say, Jason, that sounds great. You look and sound just like a model congressman. That's pretty good. Go give another speech and they'd say, that's great, you look and sound just like a model congressman. Pretty soon I went home and looked under the word model in the dictionary and it said small imitation of the real thing. So I decided to get into talk radio. Boy, you know, John gave a great speech, didn't he? Yeah! I just wish when John was talking, he wouldn't sugarcoat things quite so much, you know? Let us know how you feel next time. It's great to be back in Denver, I've got to say, but after all these great speeches, I feel a little bit like Zsa Zsa Gabor's 8th husband on their honeymoon. I know what I'm supposed to do, I'm just wondering if I can make it interesting. You people in the back can think about that for just a moment. You know, Linda gave me a call, I guess it was, I shouldn't say Linda, it was Diana, excuse me. The other woman in my life, Diana, I'm sorry. Diana gave me a call and said, hey Jason, we hear you on KHOW and we're having this big 9/12 rally. Would you like to come out, think about coming out? And I said, well, I'll think about it. She says, look, do you believe in free speech? And I said, sure. She said, how about giving one? Now, I know the 9/12 Project wanted somebody today to, with the keynote who was young, kind, good-looking, articulate. Unfortunately, Governor Ritter couldn't make it today. You know, he's the greenest governor in the entire country. I happen to think he may be the reddest, if you get my drift. Actually, I've got a confession to make. No, seriously, I do have the heart of a liberal. It's true. I keep it in a jar on my desk at the office. And right before I go in the studio every night, it kind of gets me going. I was talking to my wife before I came out last night, and I said, did you ever, in your wildest dream, think I was going to be hosting this big event in Denver, Colorado? And she looked at me for a second and said, well, you've never been in my wildest dream. Which reminds me of Hillary Clinton. You know, Hillary's back in the news. She's in the cabinet now, and apparently she had to have a little talk with Chelsea not long ago because, look, we're back in the spotlight, so the media is going to be focused on us, and I got to ask you a question, Chelsea, and it's kind of embarrassing. You're a young woman. You've been living away from home for a while, but I've got to ask you the question for media scrutiny. Mrs. Clinton had to ask her a tough question, and she just looked at her and said, Chelsea, have you had sex yet? Chelsea thought for a moment and said, not according to Dad. Now wait. I want to make this bipartisan. So let me just say I missed the Reagan years when sleeping with the president meant you attended a cabinet meeting. All right? A lot of people are asking why we're here today, most of them liberals. And, everybody's made a great case. But I mean, think of where we are. We are locked in a recession with no recovery in sight. We've got a debt going to $9 trillion. They're going to raise taxes $1.5 trillion. We've got unemployment at 9.7% and going up. Median household income plunged 4% last year. Personal income is down $427 billion from the peak of 2008. Why are we here? I'll tell you why we're here. That doesn't sound like hope and change to me. Does it sound like hope and change to you? Of course not, and that's why we're here. You know, we've awoken this not-so-silent Nixonian majority once again. The peasants are grabbing the pitchforks, and that's what democracy is all about. That's what protest is all about. That's what the First Amendment is all about. Somebody needs to tell the Denver Post and the Democratic Party and the liberals in the Republican Party that free speech is part of the Constitution and why soldiers go to fight. Now, just as John Marshall once said, the power to tax is the power to destroy. Let us update this. The power to spend is the power to destroy. It's really a crucial point, because no matter how government is financed, whether you tax, inflate, or borrow, it all comes out of your pocket. Whether it's a deficit, whether it's inflation, wiping away a lifetime of savings, and obviously taxation. It all comes out of your pocket. And for 2 decades, the big spenders have had their way in Washington and right here in Denver. They had control. They had the majority. They had a free hand. And all the big spenders could think to do with that free hand was to stick it in your pocket. Well, today we're here to say no more. Enough is enough. And it truly, amen. Enough is enough. 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 You know, it is a bipartisan problem. It really is. I mean, the spending didn't just start with the Democrat Party. We need to be objective about this. One of the reasons the Republicans are having so much trouble is they've lost their fiscal credibility. Quite frankly, the spending started in the Bush years and when the Republicans had control. And it led to a new Medicare drug entitlement with an unfunded liability of $8 trillion. It led to No Child Left Behind and centralizing education. The Department of Education, which wasn't even in existence before Jimmy Carter was elected, now spends $70 billion a year. Are your kids getting taught any better? And then, of course, the creme de la creme, the famous bailouts of 2008. Hank Paulson told the world, if we don't bail out Bear Stearns and Goldman Sachs and the rest of these Wall Street bankers, God help us. Well, maybe he had a point. We bailed them out, and God help us. The fact of the matter is, when you substitute bailouts for bankruptcy, you destroy the private sector, you destroy the economy, and we find ourselves in paralysis today because nobody's going to invest in an economy when they don't know what the government's going to do next or who's going to get the next bailout. This is a recession of uncertainty and paralysis brought to you by the United States government. If I'm going to invest in housing, but they're trying to reflate the housing bubble by paying off people's bad mortgages and refunding Fannie and Freddie, I'm not going to buy in housing until I know the government's out of business and the housing market can hit bottom. So investors stay at the sideline. When there's uncertainty, investors freeze. They hate uncertainty. Business hates uncertainty. This is very reminiscent, quite frankly, of the 1930s. You had a situation where Herbert Hoover increased spending after the crash. He increased tariffs. He increased taxes. FDR gets in there, and what does he do? He doubles down on all of them. Well, after a decade of the New Deal, after a decade of shredding the Constitution and packing the Supreme Court, it worked so well that by 1938, unemployment was still at 20%. We didn't come out of the Great Depression during World War II. Rationing stamps and tires and food isn't economic growth. We didn't come out until government cut back after the war was over and the animal spirits of the private sector were unleashed and people started working and saving and producing. Friends, you cannot spend your way out of a debt crisis, for crying out loud. We got